Hello and welcome back to the Wandering Cantos. Today we're going to continue our series on the literary genius of Aria of the Beech Forest. So, a bit about today's episode. This is our second episode on Aria of the Beech Forest, so make sure you check out our video on Volume 1 first. And don't forget to subscribe so you're notified when I post my video on Volume 3. There's 3 volumes in this series, so the next one will be the last part of this little mini-series. And in case you did miss it, Aria of the Beech Forest is basically a cozy, slice-of-life fantasy manga about a young witch living in Ireland. It feels very unique with the sort of twist of it being in modern-day Ireland. So here's your little spoiler warning for Volume 1 and 2. If you don't want this manga spoiled for you, now is time to click off the video. So, we're going to start with Chapter 7. So, the plot summary for Chapter 7, we start off with a small recap. It's then revealed that Aria has reverted back to being a homebody rather than exploring the wide world. If you'll remember, in Volume 1, it ends with her sort of chasing Gwyn and running out to this sort of vast natural landscape, and it kind of feels like she's about to explore the larger world around her, but nope, she's back at home reading books and staying inside. We learn that Alvin and Colleen's parents have actually gotten a divorce and that this has placed some strain on their lives, so they're just living with their mom. Colleen wants to throw a birthday party and invites Aria to her house. Aria wants to go, but she's nervous since she has never left the woods before. However, the party commences and Aria and Colleen spend most of the day baking. Aria has fun, but she's overwhelmed by the technology. There's things like ovens and electric tea kettles and stuff like that. It totally blows her mind. Alvin and Gwyn chat for a bit while Aria and Colleen are cooking, and we learn that Alvin studies really hard at school. And everyone then proceeds to share a meal together, and then Alvin walks Aria home. So in this chapter, some of the main themes and main ideas we see is sort of the idea of major life decisions. Alvin and Colleen's mother wonders if it was the right decision to bring them to the countryside, and in general, she's sort of struggling with basically the route that her life has taken. And we see that Alvin is studying for something really hard. We don't know what, stuff like that. We also see the idea of taking a leap of faith. Aria is afraid of leaving the woods, but she does, despite her apprehension, because she really wants to go to the party, and she ends up having a lot of fun. So, she's rewarded for taking that leap of faith. And we also see dreams of the future, which sort of goes into the idea of the life decisions. And as I mentioned earlier, Alvin is clearly studying really hard at school, but why? What are his dreams? What is he trying to pursue? So then we go to Chapter 8. So the plot summary for this one, here we get a dream/flashback to Theodore and Aria's grandmother talking. Theodore calls Aria a human, and this sort of matters because in the world building of this manga series, it seems like humans and witches are two separate things. Theodore then wakes up to find Grace in his room, and Grace demands that he tell her where Aria is. So, Grace is the sort of intimidating city woman that we saw in Volume 1, who basically had seen that Instagram post of Aria and Theodore and immediately left and went straight to Ireland. We then switch back over to Aria. Aria scares Alvin while he's fishing and reports that she's found a lost smartphone. She doesn't really understand how they work. Again, this is, high level of technology compared to what she's used to. But the owner of the phone actually calls it and asks Alvin to drop it off. So Alvin and Aria go on a bike ride and actually end up bumping into some of Alvin's friends along the way. Aria gets a bit overwhelmed by this social interaction, but soon they're back on their way to the cell phone's owner's house. A plane flies overhead, and Alvin explains a bit about how they work. Aria and Alvin then meet the owner of the lost phone. It turns out that it's an elderly couple. And so they have tea, and Aria learns about Halloween, which is an Irish holiday. The couple reveals that they never had kids, and it sort of hints that they're a bit lonely because of this. So, our themes and main ideas for this chapter are basically Aria continues to explore the world beyond the woods. She learns more about technology, meets other kids her age, and learns about Halloween. Aria has also lived a very, very sheltered life. That's sort of one of the main ideas and themes of this whole series. By learning what is new to Aria, we learn about just how sheltered she was. She doesn't know what cell phones are, like she doesn't know what electric kettles are, and so it's not just that she didn't have one and used a fireplace, but she thinks that these are like magical devices. It also sort of shows how she's very sheltered in terms of her magic education, since she wouldn't know whether an electric kettle is magic or not, and if she knew enough about magic, she would be able to identify that it wasn't magic, but she doesn't know. We also get this sort of sense of community as a major theme. So in this chapter, we learn about several forms of Irish community, and it sort of serves as an explanation for why it would be good for Aria to leave her home and sort of get out there, because then she would be able to meet more people and sort of become, invested in this community. So that brings us to chapter 9. So for the plot summary for this one, chapter 9 begins with Aria making shepherd's pie. Something I love about this series is that there's tons of instances where Aria is cooking or baking something, and at the end of the chapter, it'll usually give you a recipe of how to make it yourself, which I just think is really cute and fun. But anyway, while she's making this, she cuts her thumb while peeling potatoes. That'll be important for later. Alvin and Colleen join her for a meal, and Colleen invites Aria to join them for a trip to the grocery store. Colleen then playfully proposes to Aria since she loves her cooking so much. Aria, Colleen, and Colleen's mother go to the grocery store. Aria becomes fascinated with a potato peeler that's like a more advanced actual peeler rather than just the sort of paring knife she was using. But she quickly becomes lost in this vast grocery store. It's her first time being in such a crowded place, and just as she begins to sort of become overwhelmed with, the crowd and all of the sort of sensations of a crowded grocery store, Colleen and her mother find her. Together, they go out to eat hamburgers, and Aria saves one for Gwen. Interestingly, Gwen is thrilled to get to eat this burger and states that he didn't think he'd ever get to eat another one of these. So, for our themes and main ideas in chapter 9, basically, as Aria continues to push herself to explore the outside world, she starts to face some challenging obstacles. However, whenever she hits a wall, she is supported by her friends. So this sort of emphasizes the importance of community and friendship and the difference between community and the outside world. And that brings us to chapter 10. So, this is a pretty long chapter, so I'm breaking this sort of plot summary into 3 parts. So chapter 10 begins with Grace driving her car deeper and deeper into the forest. She uses magic to clear a path ahead. And this is important because this is one of the first instances beyond a little bit of what Theodore does with his sort of magical suitcase and Gwen transforming and being able to talk. This is one of our first instances of seeing a witch use magic. Especially since Aria hasn't been using magic, one could almost wonder up to this point whether magic truly exists, or at least whether or not witches exist. But Grace eventually reaches Aria's house and barges in while Aria and Gwen are sort of roughhousing, and it's just a kind of funny moment. Grace introduces herself to Aria and teaches her how to shake hands. Once again, we're seeing just how sheltered Aria is. Grace immediately notices that Gwen is a werewolf and almost reveals this to Aria. So remember, Aria doesn't know Gwen's true identity. Grace visits Ganita's grave. I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that correctly, but that's Aria's grandmother. So Grace clearly has some connections to Aria's grandmother and notes that her grandmother was a great witch and that her death was a loss for the whole witch community. Grace then discusses the history of Ireland with Aria and explains how witches were blamed for the famine. As a result, all of these witches left Ireland except for one, and that was Aria's grandmother. So Grace finally reveals why she has been looking for Aria. She wants Aria to come work for her company. Grace runs a company that employs witches in all sorts of different jobs. And Aria feels insecure about her magical abilities, but Grace explains that she has an education program with her company and that she can teach Aria magic. Aria, however, rejects this invitation, and she sort of gets more and more upset the more Grace tries to insist that, she come with her to London, and eventually Aria runs away. So after that, Grace and Gwyn talk alone for a bit, and Grace admits that, she does want to use Aria for her magical ability. It is a sort of capitalistic, venture. But also she sees herself in Aria, and we learn that Aria's grandmother had also raised Grace, and that Grace originally was also just sort of a girl without a strong affinity for magic. So, meanwhile, Aria comes across Grace's car and sees that it has a scratch on it. So Aria begins to sort of investigate the car. Again, remember, she's not used to technology. She's not used to things like cars, but she gets startled when Grace sneaks up behind her. Grace tells Aria a bit about her grandmother. And so her grandmother was a compassionate witch who tried to help everyone, but humans were still too suspicious of witches and were cruel to her. As a result, she, eventually fell into a depression and hid away from both humans and witches. And as a result, Grace thinks that Aria's grandmother never realized that the world outside had actually sort of calmed down and become pleasant again, at least compared to, the days of the famine. So then for our third part of chapter 10, Grace tells Aria to reach out to her if she changes her mind and leaves the forest, and she gives Aria another piece of sort of magical paper origami, which is like what Theodore gave her. Grace stops somewhere and makes a call, telling the other person on the phone that basically it was a bust. However, she's confident that Aria will eventually change her mind, since thinking about magic and your purpose in life is something all witches deal with. And then, very interestingly, before Grace drives off again, she notices that the scratch on her car is gone. So we're left wondering, does Aria actually have magical powers? So for our themes and main ideas in chapter 10, big one is generational trauma. So Aria's grandmother, intentionally or not, passed her own trauma regarding the outside world onto Aria, and it's part of why Aria is so secluded and only wants to stay in her forest and is sort of afraid of the outside world. We also, once again, sort of get an idea of dreams for the future and a fear of deciding. Trying to figure out your plans for life can be a very scary, intimidating thing, because it feels like you only really have one chance to really make this decision, and then you're sort of locked into one path forever. And that brings us to chapter 11. So in this one, chapter 11 starts with Alvin talking to his mom on the phone. She has to work, but Colleen is sick. Alvin reassures his mom that he can cook a meal for the two of them and that she should really stay at work. Alvin, however, totally messes up the cooking and ultimately asks Aria for help. While Alvin and Aria cook, Gwyn and Colleen talk. Colleen reveals that she prays for her dad to come back so Alvin will smile and laugh like he used to. Aria, however, seems to be bringing out that joy and carefreeness in Alvin, and Colleen sort of remarks that may be Aria's magic. Aria returns home after making this meal and tells Gwyn that the fact that the two of them asked her for help today made her kind of happy. Gwen states that being seen as reliable would make anyone feel good and tells Aria to consider going to London per Grace's request. This, however, results in a really bad fight between the two of them. Aria claims that all she needs is to stay in the forest with Gwen forever, while Gwen says that he doesn't know how long he'll be around and that he doesn't want Aria to waste her future. And so Aria is both overwhelmed by this sort of pressure of making sure she makes the right choice, and she's scared about the concept of going to London and leaving her home. So this pressure to leave, sort of overwhelms her. And then she's also hurt by Gwen's comment about not knowing how long he'll be around, since she wants him to stay with her forever. This sort of results in Aria having a bit of a meltdown, and she sort of chases Gwen off, and he runs outside, but it ends up being a full moon that night, and so unseen from Aria, he transforms back into a human. And so for our main themes and ideas in this one, there is anxiety around the future. So, how will one spend their future? What future career will they pursue? What if they pick the wrong choice? What is the right path forward? All these ideas are the ideas that are sort of plaguing our protagonist. We also sort of get the idea of separation anxiety. Here Aria doesn't want Gwen to leave her. She's content in the forest for now, but if she loses her few friends, she will be consumed by loneliness. And there's sort of this pressure of right now she has an access to the outside world through Colleen and Alvin, etc. But if they were to go away, for example, she would once again be alone in this forest. And we also get sort of this idea of wanting to push people in the right direction, but not knowing how. So, sometimes you want to encourage someone to do something that you think will be best for them and, in their best interest. But if they don't want to do that thing, it can cause a rift between you. So, yeah. With that being said, that sort of wraps up volume 2, so that's going to wrap up today's episode. So I wanted to thank you all for watching. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing and giving the video a like. It helps sort of grow the reach of it, but it also helps grow the sort of, conversation and discourse in the comments below. It's one of my favorite parts of running this channel is getting to actually talk about this with other people. There's not a lot of conversation about Aria in the Beech Forest online. I look around and there's not a ton of threads like you would have with a more popular series, so I would love to discuss this series with anyone else who's read it. So what are your thoughts on this manga? And so some questions going into volume 3, what do you think is going to happen if Aria realizes that Gwen isn't just a talking wolf? They've been together now for a really long time, and this is, would be a major reveal. There's also sort of a small scene where Aria gets really embarrassed when Alvin walks in on her and she's kind of partially changing, but again, Gwen this whole time is also a boy. So I feel like that's going to be a huge sort of violation of trust and whatnot when she eventually finds that out. And will Aria leave her cozy forest and Ireland to go to London? Personally, just with my own sort of personal philosophy and sort of my own worldview, I'm a bit more of a homebody, and so I always find it sort of tragic when someone has the most ideal life ever. I would kill to be living in a forest like Aria, just baking all day and reading books and going over to a neighborly friend's house and sharing tea and stuff like that. So if she leaves this for a crowded city like London, I'd be super bummed out. And I feel like there's also sort of this sort of bigger idea with this whole leaving Ireland, which is that, what the manga sort of covers is that, the Irish had to leave Ireland due to the famine. And so here we're sort of seeing that reflected as the witches having to leave Ireland. So I think there's something sort of tragic about the idea of Aria also leaving Ireland, because then truly the last witch will have left Ireland. But yeah, so we'll find out in the next episode, so stay tuned for our episode on volume 3, and once again, please consider subscribing and giving the video a like. So with that being said, take care, and I will see you in the next one.